He'd never been inside the Batscape at night before. The fluorescent lighting with darkness all around struck him at once as harsh and dirty, like the office of a deranged dentist. It cast both his face and Dantek's in stark relief. They strapped into their seats, Hennessy at the controls, and in front of Dantek, just behind and to his right, beside the ballistic release. The hoist lifted them up and over the water. They hung there, swaying for a moment, and then suddenly were released. They crashed into the water, and the darkness became even more total. Dantek flicked on the exterior lights, which dimmed the lights inside. Hennessy checked the controls. He put in his earpiece and adjusted the microphone so it wasn't scraping against the side of his cheek. He ran the F7 briefly, forward and backward, turned on the drill and watched it swirl. He checked the sonar signal. He checked the fathometer and had Dantek verify the porthole seals. Everything seemed to be in order. "This is Plotkin," Hennessy said, speaking his code name into the mic. "Are you there, dropship? Are you reading me?" Tanner's voice crackled to life in his ears. The man was there on the hollow screen, as well as image crisp, well defined. "Hearing and seeing you loud and clear," Tanner said. "Everything a go." "Oh. Roger," said Hennessy. Dantek confirmed. "Proceed when ready, Plotkin," said Tanner. Hennessy stayed for a moment with his hands on the controls, then cut the vid link and divide. "Now it is just a matter of time," thought Hennessy, 4 or 5 hours. He leaned back and stretched. At first they went down slowly, then a little faster. He was careful to adjust. The air in the F7 had grown thick and noticeably warmer. He had Dantek check the oxygen recirculator, even though he knew it was just the climate system kicking in, that it was deathly cold outside. There was from time to time the flash of a fish through their running lights, though as they descended farther and farther, this became more and more rare. Mostly it was just the two of them in the cramped vessel, breathing each other's air, just waiting. His head hurt. It seemed like it was always hurting these days. He turned slightly in his seat and cast a brief glance at Dantek, who was staring at him with steady eyes. "What is it?" asked Hennessy. "What's what?" asked Dantek. Hennessy turned back. "That guy's enough to freak anyone out," he thought. It seemed to get even hotter. The air became even more oppressive and difficult to breathe. Another 100 meters. He'd never considered how small it was inside the F7, but now that they were descending and the instruments didn't need much attention, that was all he could think about. He was sweating. It was really pouring off him, buckets of it. He felt as if he could drown in his own sweat. He laughed. "What?" asked Dantek. He laughed again. He couldn't help it. He knew it was absurd to think of drowning in your own sweat, but what if it happened? It was absurd, but all of this was absurd. "Take a deep breath and get a hold of yourself," said Dantek. He knew Dantek was right. the last thing he wanted was to dissolve into hysteria, here in a craft hardly bigger than a winter coat, miles from help. No, he couldn't do that, no. But then there it came, another chuckle. He heard Dantik's seat belt click off, then suddenly the man was there beside him, leaning on the instrument panel, the Basify listing slightly for just a moment before correcting itself. It chuckled again, and Dantik reached out and clamped his hand around his throat. Suddenly he couldn't breathe. "Listen," said Dantik. "He can do this two ways. We can do it with you alive, or we can do it with you dead. It doesn't matter to me which way we do it." He struggled, but Dantik was too strong. He had never felt anything like it, had never been so afraid. He was beginning to black out, red spots blotting out his vision. He kept gulping for air, but getting nothing. Finally, when he was just on the verge of passing out, Dantik let go, gave him a long, hard stare, and slowly returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. Hennessy sucked in air, panting, messaging his throat. "All right now?" asked Dantik, his tone flat, less a question than a command. "Yes," Hennessy said, and was surprised to find he did feel a little better, a little more in control of himself, though his head now throbbed even worse than before. Hennessy checked the controls. They were still on course. Had Dantik's action really been necessary? It was just a little giggle after all, nothing to get upset about. But Dantik had overreacted, had made a big thing of it. Someone could have gotten hurt. What had Tanner been thinking, confining Hennessy to this sinking coffin with a madman? Maybe Dantik was stronger, maybe Hennessy couldn't do anything now, but let him get back on land and he'd know what to do. He'd file a formal complaint. He'd go to Tanner and tell him about Dantik's behavior and demand the fellow's dismissal. And if Tanner wasn't willing to do anything, he'd go over his head. He'd keep filing complaints until he'd gone to the very top, to Lenny Small himself. Surely President Small was a reasonable man, and if even Mr. Small wouldn't listen, then he'd show them all. He'd take a gun and he'd 1,000 meters, said Dantik. Hennessy started guiltily, the thoughts dissolving. 1,000 meters, he repeated. He noticed a tremor in his own voice, but not too bad. Maybe Tanner wouldn't notice. He put the vid link through. "Mothership," he said. "Come in, Mother." Tanner's voice crackled, and weaker now. His image was present, but less clear, eaten away at the edges. "Here, F7, said Tanner, still reading you. 1,000 meters, he said. "Seals good, instruments good. No problem to report." "Very good," said Tanner. "Proceed." They kept descending. It seemed even slower than before. "Everything okay you're in?" Hennessy asked Dantik. "Fine," said Dantik. "And for you?" Hennessy nodded. When he did it, felt like his brain was rubbing up against the walls of his skull, getting slightly bruised. "Is the oxygen okay?" he asked. "You just asked if everything was okay, and I already told you it was," said Dantik. "Everything included the oxygen." "Oh," said Hennessy, "right." He was silent for a while, watching the water illuminate by their running lights. Nothing alive anymore, or if there was, he wasn't seeing it, floating through a dark, undefinited world. It was like his dream. He suddenly realized, which struck him as a very bad thing. "I have a headache," he said, as much to hear the sound of a voice as anything else. Dantic said nothing. "Do you have a headache too?" asked Hennessy. "As a matter of fact, I do," Dantic said, turning to him. "I've had a headache for days now." "So have I," said Hennessy. Dantic just nodded. "Stop talking," he said. Hennessy nodded back. He sat there staring out at the blank expanse surrounding them and their craft, listening to the creaking of the hull as the pressure increased. There was something else, some other sound he was hearing. What was it? Almost nothing at all. But it was there still, wasn't it? Just loud enough to hear, but not loud enough to interpret. What could it be? "Do you hear something?" he asked Dantic. "I told you to stop talking," the other said. Did that mean he heard it or not? Why couldn't he just answer the goddamn question? He'd put it civilly enough, hadn't he? "Please," said Hennessy, "I just need to know if you hear." Dantic reached out and cuffed him on the side of the head. "He doesn't hear it," a part of Hennessy's mind told him. "If he heard it, he'd be wondering about it too. Which means that either it's something close to me or near the instrument panel, or when he identified it was too terrible to contemplate. So he bent forward, tilting his right ear toward the panel, bringing it close to each instrument, listening. He kept expecting Dantic to ask him what he was doing, but the man didn't say anything. Maybe he wasn't looking at him, or maybe he just didn't care. But in any case, there was nothing. The noise was still there, but it didn't grow any louder, which meant he realized that the sound was in his head. As soon as he thought this, the noise became many noises, and these quickly became whispering voices. What were they saying? He was afraid he knew. He tried not to pay any attention, tried not to listen. "In 2,000 meters, said Dantic. "Yes," thought Hennessy, paying attention to that. "To your job. Don't think about the voices in your head. Do your job. Pull yourself together, man. Last thing you need is..." "Did you hear me, Hennessy?" Dantic asked. "I heard you," said Hennessy, shaking his head. 2,000 meters. I'll contact Tanner." He called up the link. There was Tanner, very pixelated now. 2,000 meters, said Hennessy. There was a wait of about 3 seconds before Tanner replied. "Repeat that," said Tanner, only it came out as a burst of static, and then "Repeat that." 2,000 meters, said Hennessy again, slower this time. "Roger," said Tanner after the delay. "Proceed." "Another 1,000 meters, thought Hennessy, maybe even a little less. They were more than half there. Once they were all the way down, he could occupy himself with running the drill. He'd have something to focus on. Everything would be okay. All he had to do was make it that much farther. Then they could bore down straight to the object as quickly as possible. They'd do as Tanner had asked and take a small sample of it and get back up to the surface immediately. And then, if whatever it was worth taking, it would be out of his hand. He'd fly back to the North American sector, go back to his life, putting all this out of his mind. If Tanner on Dredge Corp wanted to put together a full crew and evacuate, the object completely before other organizations got wind of it. That was their business. He'd be long out of it, long gone. If he thought about it that way, things weren't so bad. Maybe if he took short breaths, it would be better. Then he wouldn't use up the oxygen so quickly. He was still sweating, the sweat was still pouring off him, but he wasn't giggling about it now. He was afraid. He was afraid of what was happening and afraid of Dantic. Hennessy, get a grip of yourself, he thought, or rather a part of him thought. Another part was screaming in his head over and over. Another part of him was trying to force that part down below decks and then batten the hatch down. But then there were also the parts that were speaking, or rather whispering, all the whispering going on within his head that he didn't even know for sure was him at all. Hennessy, the voices were whispering. Hennessy, as if trying to get his attention. They were both a part of him and not a part of him. A wave of pain flashed through his head. He grunted and pushed his thumbs hard into his temples, and then looked back at Dantic to see if he noticed. Dantic, he saw, was clutching his head as well as his face pale and peeled with sweat. He was grimacing. After a moment, his face slipped back into expressionlessness, and he straightened, met Hennessy's gaze. "What are you looking at?" he growled. Without a word, Hennessy turned back to his control panel, hoping it had been longer, but not sure if any time at all had gone by. Maybe they still had 900 meters to go. How many meters? He asked in a flat and non-commentable a voice as possible. He watched the distorted, ghostly reflection of Dantic's face in a observation porthole. The man looked deranged. "I'll tell you when it's time," Dantic said. There was a slight tremor to his voice now. Unless Hennessy was imagining it, maybe thought Hennessy it's as bad for him as it is for me. On one level, the thought was comforting. On another, it made him realize that things might be much worse than he thought. He kept looking out the observation porthole, sometimes watching the murky water, sometimes watching Dantic's phantom reflection. How much longer, he thought, how much longer? He shook his head. Hennessy, the voices said Hennessy. They were voices he recognized, but he wasn't sure from where, and then he realized they were the voices he'd heard in his dream. But one in particular was even more familiar. He knew who it was, he was certain, but couldn't picture a face to go along with the voice. How could you hear a voice and know it was familiar, and still not know who it was? They've gotten into my head, he thought. I must have done something to let them into my head. Something is wrong with me. Oh God, he thought. Please help me. If he started screaming again, Dantic would kill him. He'd said as much. There was a flash or something outside the bath scaife and down below them. No, wait, he thought. It's just Dantic's reflection. It's nothing, but there it was again, coming out of the gray, something lighter, slightly textured. The ocean floor. He slowed the blasphemy until it was moving at a snail's pace. 3,000 meters, said Dantic. We're almost there, he told Dantic, his voice suddenly confident again. We're almost at the bottom. He watched it approach. It was a barren as the moon, a thick layer of muck extending in all directions. They settled down very softly, raising almost no sediment. A flatfish that had been lying in the dust flicked its body and glided away slowly, settling again just outside the lights. In practice runs there had been a fear that the craft would roll in landing and they'd have to struggle to right her, but she came down smooth and even. "We've made it," he said to Dante. "Should be easy from here on out." Dante just stared. Hennessy contacted Tanner. Strangely enough, the signal here was better than it had been 1,000 meters higher, perhaps because of the new angle of the craft, though there were momentary pulses of energy that fuzzed everything out. "We made it," he said, once Tanner was on. "What's it look like?" Tanner asked. "Smooth, flat," he said. "First layer anyway, shouldn't be too difficult to dig through."